and I'm hopefully going to be interesting and entertaining. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gege Gatt. Although I work in a technical role, I am a lawyer by profession, I'm afraid to say. And I'm going to try to move this discussion away from the nuts and bolts of artificial intelligence to the learned experience that we have had in deploying AI solutions to a number of European territories. So I'm sure we've understood by today's own presentations that we are not talking about a technology which is yet to hit the operational frontier. This is a technology that is here and that is in utilization in a number of large enterprises. And so I'll speak briefly about what we do in different public healthcare environments. So EBO, the company which I'm tasked to lead, is offering an automation product in the healthcare segment, where we provide technology that automates the conversation between the state and the citizen. So in the UK, the NHS is serving 60 million citizens. And most of these, as you could see in the graph behind me, feel unhappy about the service which they receive from their country. And perhaps this is the same experience you all have in your different European territories. Most European citizens feel unhappy about the level of service and engagement with public healthcare. Now, when you look at the data as to why this is so, it's usually not about clinicians being poor in their trade or unable to provide the right clinical advice. Very often it comes down to these factors, which is we are unable to use technology to facilitate the accessibility and engagement of the citizen with the public health service. So what EBO does is provide this automation toolset, of course based on NLP and NLG, to deliver this interface, at this touch point, this service of communication between the state and tens of millions of citizens. Now, when I ask this fundamental question, which is what is AI, I'd like us to move away from our technical role and see it from the eyes of a child. And in fact, just only a few months ago, I was asked to give a talk in a 6-year-old classroom, full of very energetic young kids. And I had a problem preparing for this lesson, because how are you going to define AI in an age group where, as the acquisition of norms graph can show us, usually kids understand the word artificial when they're age 10, and they understand the word intelligence when they're age 8. So I built a definition of my own, which I use with these young kids, which I'm going to use with you all today, which is this. AI is when you create a little computer like a little brain, right? And you feed it information, let's call this the machine learning process, which might be words or images, and the computer will create patterns that allows it to answer questions or formulate new questions of its own. And of course, we do have a formal definition of the term, and we understand it deeply from a computer science perspective, but I believe, at least from an entrepreneurial perspective, that it's best to keep things simple. So, throughout today's discussion with you, we're going to frame AI from the way a 6-year-old child will look at it. And whenever I debate politicians or CEOs, that's exactly the type of approach I use. In fact, a few weeks after this school event, I was debating Dr. George Papandreou, who is a socialist Greek, former Prime Minister of Greece, and I used the same definition, and I got the same type of questions that the kids asked me in the classroom. Can I marry a robot? Will the robot take my job? And so on and so forth. Of course, we also discussed notions of AI ethics and whether AI is a threat or a boom to society, and I'd like to touch on some of those points today. But what we've certainly understood, and today's conference was a great example of that, is AI is going to require humankind to readjust very rapidly to the technological change that we are experiencing. I think we need to readjust the way we think about ourselves, we think about public policy in technology and the economy, and it's fair to say that thinking itself is changing fast. We traditionally thought that thinking is a function of our brain. I think today you'll agree that thinking is a fused function of our brain and the tools which we either hold in our hand or we abstract in data centers. These tools are becoming extremely complex that we are often unable to tell the difference between what is human-generated cognitive content and what is AI artifact. And so I choose to play a little game with you and see how many of you have the right cognitive capabilities. So I've put two poems on stage, on screen. They're quite short. I'd like you to read them both. And then I'm going to ask you who thinks the left poem is written by AI and who thinks the right poem is written by AI. Okay, I'll give you a few seconds to read them. They're actually quite beautiful. So who thinks the left poem is written by AI? Hands up. The left. Your left.
Can we use AI to guess?
It's probabilistic, so it might be a bit tough. So about 1/3 of the room, who thinks that the poem on the right is written by AI? Kind of the same. We've got some 1/3 abstentions, 1/3 for each side. Well, so the poem on your right is written by Robert Frost, a very important American wartime poet, and of course the poem on the left is written by GPT. It's not important if we guessed or otherwise, right? I think what we're realizing as a society is that we need to reflect on how human agency and AI capabilities come together. Let's do another test. Let's move from text to visuals. You don't need a PhD in history of art to get the sense that these pictures come from the post-impressionism period. They're probably French, I'd say roughly 1900s. I'm going to go to the same test. You've taken a second to look at them. That's enough. So who thinks that this picture is by AI hand? We've got a confident room, 1/3. Who thinks that this picture is an AI tool? A bit more, right? A bit more, I think. Yeah, 40% of the room. And who thinks they are both? I think it was a gentleman, but we've got two people. What's your name? Who said both? Eugene. Okay, right, so Eugene and the man at the back are both right. Of course, here we're using GANs, right? So, I mean, generative adversarial networks have really allowed us to pit systems against each other to create optimized outcomes. But we know that the peril of content generation is also a threat to democracy. I mean, this last story from Tom Hanks, in my view, was absolutely incredible, right? So the man says that he's in the bathroom, brushing his teeth, and sees an advert of himself advertising a particular dental product which he never consented to, never got paid for, never produced, was never involved in. And of course what we know is that content generation and the tools that we have today are significantly challenging for us to govern from a legal perspective or even from a policy perspective. But moving away from the general stuff, I'd like to share with you the 4 lessons that I have learned in growing EBO and scaling the company to a number of AI initiatives. These are mega trends, which I think we could possibly leave the room with today and have perhaps understood the key components of growth in AI. So the first one, which I'd like to speak about, is this concept of ultra-digitization that we see in the industry. So, most AI systems today can recognize one face from 50 million in less than 1 second. Imagine what that means for predictive policing in most pattern recognition tasks. I mean, it changes industries really rapidly. Another example, especially in the world of science and academic papers, is that most AI models today can ingest 3,000 academic papers, summarize them all, and create new insights. Let's define insights widely for a moment, in less than 11 seconds. But when I did my doctoral degree, it would usually take a PhD researcher about a decade to do the same amount of work. So this is changing industries like biomed so rapidly, where we could create insights in a way which we have never thought of before. And that's exactly what we do in most of our healthcare projects. So here's one example from within EBO. This is a hospital based in Wales. I won't even try to pronounce the name, which you see on the top right, because the Welsh language is impossible. But we'll call it Betsy, which is the English variant of the name. It's your typical hospital, right, in Wales. Annual budget of just under 2 billion. They'd be serving around 700,000 people, employing around 20,000. So like most European states, Wales has a huge problem in waiting lists, right? Patients waiting to get a knee replacement, hip surgery, or whatever. And the state is unable, like nearly every European country, to keep in touch constantly with the patient to reprioritize and revalidate the list of patients based on clinical criteria. So what we did is we've digitized the entire health record of the entire population cohort, and using basic algorithmic capabilities, we revalidate and reprioritize that list on a daily basis. Not only does it free up slots for operations that shouldn't be taken by people who don't need them, but it saves a heck of a lot of money. So when we ran our first trial with just 20,000 patients, the hospital was saving £137,000 each time it ran one validation cycle, when compared to the analog traditional way of sending letters, making phone calls, swapping Excel sheets, and so on and so forth. Right, so what AI is doing through ultra-digitization is picking up all the data points which allow us to make informed decisions without bias. Needless to say, some countries are taking this to an extreme. Right, have any of you followed the golden tax system in China? It's crazy. So what they're doing is, through their ultra-digitization effort, they're picking up all the social footprints left by Chinese citizens. It could be the picture you put on Instagram, the Facebook post you added, and from it, they're predicting your wealth. Based on that wealth, they're determining what your income tax or your tax payments should be to the state. So they've done something which was quite interesting. They used 30,000 tax professionals to create the machine learned model and improve it. When it reached an accuracy of 96%, they got rid of those 30,000 people, placed them elsewhere, and now you have a machine learned process with a high level of accuracy, which digitizes without consent information and reaches an outcome which you have no redress appeal from when it comes to tax computation. I mean, it's nuts, right? And it shows you the difference of scale when you take digitization and AI to a ridiculous level. Now, the technology which we're using, I think, isn't just better than us in certain domains, it is phenomenally and incomparably better than human agents. And I think the edge which we've lost as humans will never be regained. And maybe that's fine. Maybe our job is not to excel in computation. Maybe it is to excel in other areas, perhaps ethics, decision-making, creativity, empathy, and so on. But this is a really important force that we are looking at. So the second mega trend that I'd like to introduce is the concept of dematerialization. So, for those of you who have some grey hair, like me, you probably remember this type of environment where most of the interfaces that we used were hugely physical, hugely tactile, and required a large amount of physical maneuvering. We now live in a world where the single interface to AI is this magical glass box, this one single smartphone which we use for trading, for praying, for unlocking our door, for capturing any type of memory, and of course speech is the new interface to this glass box to trigger the AI processes that we wish. And we often forget how the smartphone in our pocket is around 1,000 times more powerful than the supercomputer we used to put man on the moon in 1969 in the Apollo 11 mission, right? And we're getting so many onboard capabilities with small language models which we utilize on device itself. And of course, this capability is moving from our devices and entering into hardware elements, right? So autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, using basic AI capabilities around computer vision and other elements were unheard of 6-7 years ago. Today, every European state, including Malta, has legislation that allows for long-haul truck driving autonomous vehicles. I mean, I don't know where you do it in Malta, but what I'm sure is that the next generation, or our kids, or kids aged 3 or 4, are probably the last generation which will ever need to take a driving test. And thank God for that. Right, so when we think about this concept of dematerialization, right, we could also think of it from a business perspective. So we are hugely changing the monetization, the way commercial activity occurs. So let's look at business models. So what we are doing has changed public healthcare assessments, consent programs, appointment management activities radically. You know, Amazon's AI is so good that its predictive capability around interest, right, and personalization of recommendations has totally changed what marketplaces look like. And we can go on and on. So YouTube's algorithm has changed the entertainment industry. It is the best behavioral modification tool we have, which captures attention today. So I think we need to ask ourselves, as these tools are demonetizing the industry, what will happen to workers? And what will happen to the principle of work? So I'd like you to look at the slide I've put up right now. So for those of you who are Maltese, you're going to immediately recognize this. This is our national anthem, Innu Malti, written by a priest, of course. And I'm going to highlight 2 parts of it and also translate those into English for the non-Maltese speakers here. So part of our national anthem says, Rot il-ħnina lis-sit u s-saħħa lil-ħaddiem, which roughly translates into God grant benevolence to the employer and wellness to the employee. Now, our entire political history is based on this rhetoric, right, from the days of Karl Marx, which separates the employer and the employee, the person with access to capital and the person with access to means of production and labor. But with the automation of work that AI brings forward, whereby 45% of all tasks in industry today could be automated, who are we asking God to protect? Who is the employee if that employee's tasks are now being shifted to a robotic process? And I think this makes us ask ourselves a few other broad questions. What does a fair wage mean today? Can we conduct performance appraisals where we pit human agency with AI agency? What is the future of work? Is it about the fusion between these 2 tools? So I think that there is a fantastic opportunity ahead for most governments in Europe who are willing to take this challenge and to really rethink these very basic principles which we have held firmly for the last 60 or 70 years. We are living in exciting times. Okay, the last mega trend I'd like to talk about is this concept of democratization, right? The ability of scaling AI capacity over a large, dense population cohort, which was never possible before. And I want to start with this example, also from our work, talking about sex. Or, well, actually, sexually transmitted diseases, STDs, a little bit worse. Okay, so in the Brexit process, the UK, which serves 60 million patients, lost most of its clinicians, right? Most of its doctors and nurses, principally Greek, Polish, and from other European nations, left. So what happened is that their ability to match patient and clinician gender and age ended. So in most clinics, especially in STD clinics, they started seeing these type of situations where you have a 16-year-old sexually active female patient who's being met with a 65-year-old male clinician. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in theory, of course. We all know the political correctness around that. But the reality is that the social awkwardness that was created when you put a young girl talking about a sexual experience with a much older, different gendered male, in this case, meant that service usage in STD clinics went down, right? Because there was social awkwardness. All the responses given to doctors were insincere. As a result, the medical decision-making was poor. So what we did is we rethought the entire model. We pulled out the human from the first stages of that workflow, of that process, and instead we implemented a virtual agent which would match the gender of the patient, which would not provide social judgment about the case being discussed. Now, what you might think as being a basic AI intervention changed the entire health profile of a nation. Within 2 years, the incidence of chlamydia dropped by 82%. So what was happening in most cases is when these clinics were not being used because of social awkwardness, sexual diseases continued progressing. And if you treat something like chlamydia in week 1, it's no problem. If you're treating it after 2 years, it's a huge problem and a huge cost for the state. So when we use AI to democratize its service capability, we can really change the fabric of how our society works. And the speed at which we will access this service is constantly changing. So for those of you who have followed the news this week, we had the latest announcements from Nokia around functional 6G, which is 100 times faster than the 5G service that we are using today. And we're expecting release in Malta in 2028. We're 4 years away. Now, 6G speeds will give us access to our AI models at an incredible, fundamentally different type of experience. To give you one sense of it, you will be able to download on 6G 142 hours of Netflix content in 1 second. I mean, that just changes the paradigm of interface between us, our tools, and the content. Now, I'm sure you've realized by this point of our little conversation that this is not a technical discussion about artificial intelligence. This is about the topic of change. Right? How can these 4 megatrends change our industry, our businesses, our nations? And with change, I have another little game I'd like to play. On the screen, this is 1910, and we are in the 5th Avenue in New York. It's clearly a very busy day. There are lots of horses which are driving carts, perhaps 100 or so of them on screen now. But amidst the horses, there is one solitary car. Can you spot it? Where? Right, Clayton has sharp eyes. Your left, right. There you go, right? So the ratio of 1:100, the first car appearing in otherwise a horse-driven economy. So this is an important period in American economic history development. So Henry Ford has built his first Model T car in Detroit. That was 1908. And this is the technology of the time. This is the AI of the 20th century, right? Now, we're in 5th Avenue again, but it's 1913, 3 years after the first photograph which I showed you. We're seeing a road which is full of cars and an inversion of the statistic we saw earlier. There is one horse-driven cart amongst these 100 cars. Can you see where that horse is? Ah, such good eyes. Guys, we're done. Okay. But so the important part of this is not about the speed of change, although, well, that's also a factor, right? But to ask ourselves this question. So for those of you who follow American development history, this was one of the most difficult times in their economy, right? They went straight into a depression, despite the fact that they had the technology of the time. Most horse drivers who knew all the routes, they were the Google map of the time. So they had the access, they had the client base, they had the data of routing, they knew the patterns of movement. None of them became cab drivers. Most of them moved into destitution, and their families lived on the street, poor and often without the ability to feed themselves. So why is that? Why were they stubborn? Why did they not change? Why did they not see the writing on the wall? And maybe this is the most important slide of our discussion today. The reason for that reluctance is because most organizations and most people amongst us always define themselves by what they already do, by what they already know, however limited, ancient, and irrelevant that is. So we drive horses, we won't drive cars. We sell ice flakes, forget fridges, right? We sell fax machines, so screw the whole email thing that's going on. We're banks, we're not going to play with Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies or whatever. So I think today we really need to think about what change means in our nation states, in our companies, in our little groupings, right? Because it's this behavior which we need to focus on, which is going to unshackle us from this idea of getting stuck. Because we are not horse drivers. We love innovation. And I'd like to close off maybe with a couple of thoughts about our nation. I think this is a huge opportunity for Malta. It is a unique opportunity for a small island to change in the face of this large sea of challenges which is around us. My theory is that we need to build an anti-fragile culture, right? A culture that is not merely embracing change, but actually improves because of it. No, we need to be more resilient. We need to build a culture that defines itself by the identity of change. And of course, that doesn't mean AI is without harm or risk. There are huge, real risks, right, in this particular technology. I mean, 7 years ago, The Guardian ran this story when we had much weaker models than we had today, where it said, by just a few data points on a photo, we could distinguish straight men 81% of the time between straight and gay men, and in 74% of the time between straight women and gay women. And this is in 2017, where we had so much weaker technology. Imagine if this capability of predicting anything, any marker, could be used by groups in society that are here to spread division, hatred, misinformation, or disinformation. Imagine what that could mean for our privacy legislation in the context of an abuse scenario, in an anti-LGBT type of purpose. So there are risks in technology, as there are with every technology, and it is our job to have a responsible and ethical framework that also includes skills and capabilities that we spoke about in today's conference. My prediction is that by the end of this decade, there are only going to be two types of companies remaining. Those who have fully embraced AI in their operating model, and those which are out of business. Right? So how do we get into category one? These are my last three parting notes. The first is to understand that computational power is doubling year on year, right? Which is reminiscent of Moore's law. Number of transistors that fit into a microprocessor will double each year. That is giving us the capability within 1 year to create new generations of LLMs which we never thought were possibly achievable in 12 months. Secondly, the concept of global data, which is such an opportunity for us. So, Nature magazine, which is an important peer-reviewed scientific journal, has predicted that by the end of this decade, the global population will be creating 1 yottabyte of data per year. I'm going to say that again because the word is cool. Yottabyte of data. Do you know how much that is? So again, for those of you who have grey hair like me, do you remember those DVD dual density discs? 4 gigs on one side, 4 gigs on the other side, giving you a total of 8. So if you had to pack these DVDs from where we are now and keep on going up until it gets to 1 yottabyte, that will take you to Mars. That's the amount of data that we're creating every single year. So as a business, as an industry, as a nation, how equipped are we to utilize that data, to leverage it for the needs of the business in an ethical way? And I think the third thing to keep in mind is the cost to train these models is going down drastically. So over the last 5 years, I calculate we've reduced the training cost by about 99.5%. So that which was inaccessible 5 years ago, today is probably available at a marginal cost of almost zero. And if trillion-dollar companies like Microsoft are going all in with generative AI, making it the most important choice of this generation, then my view is that your companies, your nations, your groups should probably not think, is it too early? You need to get there now, right? This is the key strategic move that we need to make as an organization. Let me end here. I've always believed that digital is not about technology. I think digital is about people. I think it's about culture, right? Innovation isn't just about new ideas. I think it's about the right ideas at the appropriate time for our business, right? It's not a transformational journey which is short-term. We want these long-term strategic projects which bring people on board, which change societies and which change businesses. For Malta, this is the most necessary journey which we need to do. Imagine a public service infrastructure with AI-enabled capabilities, with no bias, with immediacy, with responsiveness, with accuracy, fairness, and transparency. And the beauty of it all is that AI is ever evolving, right? It's endlessly scalable. And I truly believe that the future does not belong to those companies and to those groups that wait, but it truly belongs to those who are brave enough to innovate. Thank you very much. Thank you. Calvin, all yours.